Hey everyone, today we're going to test out Cyberpunk 2077 running on the new Onexfly APEX, which is an absolute beast, running the AI Max Plus 395. So we're going to test this at a number of different TDP settings, plugged in and on battery, and we're going to test out a number of settings. So let's start off first with plugged in at 80 watts. And before I go further, this device is the air-cooled version. I don't have my liquid-cooled model yet. That'll be coming at a later date. So the first settings that we're trying out is 80 watts plugged in. We're at 1200p with ray tracing overdrive, frame generation on, and we're using FSR 3 set to auto. Now I definitely don't recommend playing like this. You can see on screen that, frame generation at this low of a frame rate is just not recommended, but I wanted to show it just to see what it could actually do. And keep in mind, this is with path tracing. Now that we've gotten the unhinged test of trying out path tracing, let's move on to regular ray tracing. So we're going to have this at ray tracing ultra 1200p with frame generation on and FSR 3 set to auto. And with these settings, it's a little bit more realistic. So we're actually above 60 FPS in this test. We're sitting sometimes close to the 70s or even in the 70s. And with these settings, you could definitely play at this and I think have a good time. I'm not really detecting much as far as any kind of lag. As long as you're using the AMD anti-lag, I don't really think you're gonna have an issue with playing at these settings. The game looks really good, it's really sharp. You have ray tracing built in and not just ray tracing, but ultra ray tracing. So it looks phenomenal. I'm actually highly impressed with what it's pulling off here. Now we're going to keep things at the exact same settings, 80 watt, 1200p, ray tracing ultra, but we're going to turn off frame generation. So with frame generation turned off, it's actually performing pretty decent. We're getting, in the 30s, sometimes all the way up to 40 FPS, which is definitely a playable experience and it looks absolutely beautiful. We have FSR 3 set to auto, so I'm not sure exactly what kind of upscaling it's doing, but it is very minimal because it's a very crisp image here. So yeah, this is another setting that I would recommend playing if you're wanting to avoid frame generation. I still think that even with it off, you're going to get a super playable experience. Now we're going to move on from ray tracing and we're going to switch to ultra settings. And I'm going to start off first with frame generation off. And we're going to keep this at, like I said, ultra settings with FSR 3 set to quality, which is the default for ultra settings, 1200p, and of course plugged in at 80 watts. With this, our frame rate seems to be, somewhere in the 50s and sometimes actually down to the mid 40s. So it's playable, it runs well. But I think we can probably do a little bit better here with some frame generation. So if we turn on frame generation and leave the exact same settings, we're going to keep our settings at ultra, 1200p, FSR set to quality. We should be able to see a pretty big uplift here. And sure enough, we got a pretty big boost. So we're actually, close to 90 to 100 FPS. Sometimes it'll drop down closer to the 80s, but more often than not, it seems to be close to 100, which is pretty impressive. Now we're going to turn off frame generation, turn off FSR. We're going to have just native resolution here of 1200p. Again, once again, we're at 80 watts and we're keeping it at ultra settings. So with these settings, we're getting around the mid 40s, which is not bad. It's certainly a playable experience here. Without any frame generation, we're not going to get any of the anti-lag without any upscaling. We don't have to worry about any kind of image quality degradation. Not that FSR really does a lot of that, but you're going to get the cleanest image you can with these settings, and it's still extremely playable. And now one more test at 80 watts just for the fun of it. We're at 1200p. We're going to go down to low settings. We're going to keep on frame generation, and we're going to turn on FSR 3. So let's see what we can get if we're trying to push the absolute maximum frames here. So with these settings, we seem to be in the high 130s, sometimes down to 120, but realistically, our refresh rate on the screen here is 120, so anything above that, we're not really seeing the benefit of. But with these settings, yeah, you can definitely max out this display and have over 120 FPS. Now we're on our battery tests here. We're going to be at 55 watt. I'm going to run through the battery tests a little bit quicker this time. So we're going to stay at 1200p. We're going to be at ultra settings, frame generation on, and FSR 2.1 set to auto. And with these settings, we seem to be over 60 FPS. So that's really all that we want here. So 55 watts, you can still play at ultra settings with frame generation and have a pretty good experience with steady frame rates, and I don't really notice any kind of lag here. Keeping the exact same settings, but turning off frame generation will get us around 40 FPS. So what you could do there is you could lock the FPS to 40, and because this is a 120 Hz display, it's going to mesh pretty well. And 40 FPS, it's a pretty decent experience, especially if you have it locked. Like, it's not 60, but it's still pretty smooth. Now for the last test here for 55 watt, we're going to turn off frame generation, or keep it off, I should say, and we're also going to turn off FSR. With these settings, we're still getting around 30 FPS to mid 30s, which is not too bad. If you're looking for a 30 FPS experience with no upscaling and no frame generation, you'll get the cleanest image possible here, and you don't have to worry about any kind of like frame generation lag. Not that there's a lot, but you don't have to worry about it at all. Now we're going to drop down to 30 watts, and I'm going to do one more test at the same settings. That's 1200p, ultra settings, frame generation, and FSR set to auto. But with this test moving forward, I think I'm going to have to change it to another preset because ultra is just a little bit too taxing at the really low watts on this chip. Seeing how we're not really getting a locked 60 here, like we're close, but we're not quite there, I would probably recommend adjusting the settings because frame generation with a total FPS under 60 is just not a fun experience. To change things up, we're going to switch over to the Steam Deck preset. We're going to stick with 1200p as well and frame generation on, and let's take a peek at how that does. And we seem to be in the high 70s and up to 80s, so certainly a playable experience, and I don't really feel like the lag is too bad, or I should say the input delay. With the anti-lag turned on, this seems to be a non-issue for a game like this. But if you don't want frame generation, you can turn that off and you can expect somewhere between 40 to 45 FPS. And lastly, for 30 watts, if you don't want FSR on at all, you can turn that off and you can expect, about 40 FPS. So it's not much different than the Steam Deck preset with the FSR balanced. Now we're going to change things up and drop down to 22 watts on battery. We're going to use the same settings, 1200p Steam Deck preset with frame generation. And with these settings, we're sitting in the high 50s and sometimes into the 60s. So not a locked 60, but not too far away. And now keeping to the same settings and turning off frame generation, it's looking like we're somewhere in the mid 30s for our frame rate, not quite hitting 40, but also not dipping below 30. And lastly, for 22 watts, what we're going to do is we're going to turn off FSR. We also have our frame generation off, same settings. And with this, we're not quite breaking 30, like we are under 30 quite a bit, so I wouldn't recommend using these settings. Now we're going to drop down to 15 watts, and this is where this device struggles a lot. So I'm going to turn the settings all the way down to as low as I can, use FSR performance, and we're going to stay at 1200p to see how it does. And with these settings, we're not breaking 30 FPS. It's a pretty rough experience, so I don't recommend staying at 1200p. We're going to lower things down to 800p at this point. Now that we're at 800p with the lowest preset here, we are getting, roughly 30 FPS, 35 sometimes, and this is with no frame generation, no FSR. So if we want to get a little bit better performance, we're going to need to utilize FSR at least a little bit. Turning on FSR to balanced, we get just a little bit of a bump here, but not really that significant. Like we're looking at the mid 30s, sometimes all the way up to 40 and in the mid 40s, but for the most part, it's just a small improvement over FSR being turned off. And now a couple of tests that are just for the fun of it. We're going to drop this down to 10 watts and you can see we get a nice slideshow at 20 FPS with the same settings we were testing before. And now we're going to also drop it down to 6 watts. And this is definitely not recommended. I could barely close the menu, but you're going to get an absolute slideshow of like 12 FPS. So, I mean, the fact that it's still running the game at 6 watts is still pretty impressive. Of course, if you're going to drop down to 6 watts, maybe just save that for indie titles because it has no business being that low for AAA games. So that's going to wrap it up for this one. I tested this game much more than I typically do, but I wanted you guys to see basically how this chip runs with Cyberpunk at so many different settings and different wattages, just to give you a better idea. The other gameplay tests I'm going to do probably won't be quite as in-depth. I'll cut those back just a little bit. And that's going to wrap it up for this one. If you want to see more Apex content, check out this channel as well as my main channel, The Okayest Gamer. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.